Welcome to Spotlight. Building a Grad Nation is a new report done by my guest today, John Bridgeland, CEO of Civic Enterprises. Welcome, John.
Nice to be with you, Jody.
John is not only with Civic Enterprises, but Truth in Advertising. You're a key partner and player in Spotlight on Poverty itself. John comes from the Bush White House Domestic Policy Council, the most recent Bush White House, and as well, newly appointed, was it just yesterday?
Just this week,
Just
yes.
this week by President Obama to the newly created White House Council for Community Solutions.
That's right.
Congratulations,
Thank
John.
you very much.
Talking about the report, Building a Grad Nation, what are the rest of the words after that colon?
Progress and challenge in meeting the high school dropout epidemic.
You know, it boosts the national high school graduation rate to something like 90% by 2020.
Well, that's our plan.
Right.
The first thing this report uncovers after more than a decade of gloomy reports on the state of our young people dropping out from high school is that across 29 states, we saw significant increases in high school graduation rates, including in some of the most, what we thought were chronically unfixable areas like large urban school districts.
You're talking good news here.
Good news. We've got
Whoa.
some good, hopeful news.
Wow, that's exciting. So let me, though, understand, if the goal is 90% by 2020, what's our starting line?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Before this report was issued, and earlier in the decade, about 1/3 of all public high school students in the United States were dropping out. About 50% of African Americans, American Indians, and Latinos were leaving school, and with huge implications to them personally, individually, economically, and to our society. The good news is that in this report we show a national increase of about 3 percentage points over the last 7 years, and in some states like Tennessee, a 15 percentage point gain from 60% to 75% of the number in rates of high school graduation.
That's really good news. Let's put this in context, though. You do a lot of attention and focus on what you call dropout factories.
We do.
First, can you tell us what you define is a dropout factory? And also maybe play out the question of, even if you succeed in really reducing the number of dropout factories, which are typically located in high poverty communities,
Right.
what are the implications for poverty?
Yes. A high school dropout factory, which is a very tough term,
Yeah.
but it ought to be. These are places where it's about a 50-50 proposition whether you graduate from high school. So imagine being a student in one of these high schools where half of your class will not go through the graduation line. Technically, it's defined as a place where 60% or less of the student body is graduating from high school. There have been historically about 2007 high school dropout factories in the United States in 2002. The good news in this report is we've seen a reduction of about 261 high school dropout factories. So the rates of graduation are increasing in those high schools. In terms of its relationship to poverty, most of these schools are in high poverty areas. We know from an individual perspective that a young person who drops out of high school will have lifetime earnings of about $1 million less than a college graduate. We know a dropout disproportionately lives in poverty throughout their lives, higher chances of being in prison, higher chances of being unhealthy, higher chances of being a single parent who will go on and have children who will also in turn drop out from high school. So it's an intergenerational problem that has to be addressed.
Well, clearly high school completion matters dramatically. Our listeners come at the issue of poverty and opportunity from a wide array of angles.
Yes.
Would you say that high school completion ought to be prioritized over all others, or where do you put high school completion in the context of the overall effort?
Yeah, our friends Ron Haskins and Bell Sawhill at Brookings talk about this powerful set of statistics they've looked at, that if you graduate from high school, have a full-time job, and get married before your first child, your chances of living in poverty are seen everywhere from 7 to 2%. If you do none of those things, your chances of living in poverty are 70 to 80%. So high school completion is an absolute precondition to having an ability to climb that ladder of opportunity for so many young people in this country. It's not a silver bullet. It can't work in isolation. We know that family circumstances, the constitution of the American family, communities and social networks, healthcare, housing, shelter, basic elements of the social safety net are absolutely essential to ensure young people, when they enter the schoolhouse door, are actually equipped to learn.
John, you were just giving us some really encouraging news about positive developments about school completion. What's your take as to why this good news is happening?
You know, it's really interesting. We drilled down and provided some case studies. I'll give you two quickly. One is the state of Tennessee. Governor Phil Bredesen said, we have a skills gap. We have a workforce shortage. We're not able to draw from our own Tennesseans to meet the needs of our workforce. We need 269,000 college degree holders to fill the skills gap by 2025. It galvanized the state. The state got organized. They got good data. They set a high school graduation rate goal of 90% by 2014. They got data on where the problem was in 5 urban school districts in Tennessee, and they mobilized against it. They formed an exemplar educators team that were dispatched to these school districts to train educators to help boost student achievement. They sent leaders who helped train principals on best practices, because we know the importance of school leadership and whole school reform in affecting change. And as importantly, they mobilize community-based supports. So in every school, you've got boys and girls clubs for extended learning, Big Brothers, Big Sisters mobilizing mentors and tutors to help young people who are in trouble, communities in schools that go deeper and look at students who have very difficult problems that merit more support in the community, whether it's healthcare or disabilities or other issues.
You've pulled all the ideas together into what you're calling a civic Marshall Plan.
Yes.
Fill us in.
Okay.
It's no small plan here.
It's not. It was interesting. Secretary of State George Marshall went into his policy planning staff, and he had 2 words for them: avoid trivia. And so that's our motto: avoid trivia. We brought together a wonderful group of people: the National Governors Association, National Conference of State Legislatures, National PTA, the teachers unions, community-based organizations, business leaders, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Also sought input from the U.S. Department of Education, the White House, Corporation for National Community Service. And we have developed what we call a civic Marshall Plan. And it's an effort to meet the president's goal of a 90% high school graduation rate by the class of 2020. That's just not some amorphous goal. We actually take it seriously. We say those are the 3.7 million students in 3rd grade today who, if we work to support those who are falling off track, we can meet this goal. What gives us encouragement is that, and we set benchmarks along the way, on early reading, on absenteeism, on the development of early warning systems, on improving middle schools, teaching and making sure the reforms are in place, that they're engaging the students, and the coursework is rigorous. As they move into high school, 9th grade academies, we know 9th grade is a very tricky year as young people move from middle and junior high into high school. And finally, school transformation. Some schools need to be closed and replaced. Others need to be transformed. And with support, unprecedented federal support, through President Obama and Secretary Duncan's school improvement grants, we're now targeting the very schools, these high school dropout factory schools, and their feeder middle and elementary schools, with not just the resources, but the business leadership, community leadership, and policymaking and educational leadership that can ensure that we stay on track to meet these goals.
It strikes me there's an inherent tension with an aggressive, visionary target for high school completion, which you've set out here.
Yeah.
The tension is between moving hard and fast to reach the target and get kids a high school diploma, and having that diploma be substantive and quality and mean something and mean more than a head count, but something inside the head to make decisions.
It's a wonderful question, and it's something we focused a lot of attention on. We do not want to create diploma mills in this country, where we're just cranking more students through these factories, through this system, and it's basically a degree of certificate of participation. Doesn't mean much.
Yeah.
The good news here is when you look at the state of Tennessee, look at the state of Alabama, You look at Richmond, Indiana, you look at New York City, you look at the examples of states and school districts that boosted their high school graduation rates. It was about rising to a standard of excellence. To reinforce that, we discovered after decades of research on the dropout problem that no one had ever talked to the customer, to the dropouts themselves, remarkably.
You did.
And so we did. And one thing we learned that surprised some people is that the dropouts themselves, here were individuals who made this profound decision, you know, at 16, 15, 17, to leave school with huge implications for them, socially, economically, for the rest of their lives. President Obama says it more eloquently, dropouts not only give up on themselves, they give up on their country. It actually turns out to be true. They don't vote, they don't participate in community projects, they don't volunteer. 40% are idle, they're not in school, they're not in work. So huge consequences to the individual and to society. But even they said we wanted more challenge. We wanted more rigor, we wanted more engagement. I sat with a young woman from Philadelphia who was a dropout. I said, what did you want to be when you began your life? And she said, I wanted to be an astrophysicist. And I said, a what? And she said, an astrophysicist. I was inspired by NASA, the NASA space program. And I said, what are you doing now? And she said, I'm working in the streets. She was a prostitute. And to see how a young person can go from the same kind of career dreams as other young kids have to a series of disconnects in a system, a slow process of disengagement, wanting teachers to know her name, to know what her interest was, to maybe connect a science course to her interest in space flight and space engineering. That never happened. And those schools and school districts that are actually creating a more rigorous curriculum, challenging students more. The good news in this report is that it is clearly about rising to a standard of excellence for those schools that are boosting high school graduation rates. It was the most encouraging thing we found. So I'm glad you asked the hardball question.
Well, let me ask you a different excellence question.
Yeah.
In order to really move something like this, excellence needs to be achieved amongst policymakers.
Yes.
This town is divided. Do you have reason to believe that this issue can bridge that divide?
I do. John Kennedy talked about the power of education to America's future. Lyndon Johnson talked about it. Richard Nixon talked about it. Gerald Ford talks about it. George H.W. Bush set a goal to increase high school graduation rates. But at the time, we had very, very poor data that was overestimating where we were as a nation. George W. Bush passes No Child Left Behind, introducing new accountability for results in our system. And President Obama and Secretary Duncan have made education reform a top priority and have backed it up with very innovative ideas. Race to the Top has used the leverage of potential federal resources, and it has fostered reform and change in states throughout the country, including many states who have not gotten a dime from Race to the Top. These school improvement grants, which were created in the Bush administration, actually have been, new life has been breathed into them. They're targeting the dropout factory high schools with real resources, but also tough love. You've got to follow one of these research-based models and transform your schools in order to continue to qualify to get support. So I think across administrations, across party, look at the Constitution of the House. Speaker of the House, John Boehner, was a lead author of No Child Left Behind. He has done great things on education reform with his partner, George Miller. In the Senate, Senator Lamar Alexander, former Secretary of Education under a Republican president, is now a real leader in advocating for education reform, including the high school dropout crisis. So we're really hopeful that in this tough environment with a lot of partisan mudslinging, we think for the sake of our children and the more than 1 million young people who are making this decision to drop out every year in a system that's failing them, and we have a plan to help address it. We think the dropout epidemic is fixable and that bipartisan leadership in Congress and with the President will lead the way.
Thank you for joining us on Spotlight, John, and congratulations on the report, on the appointment, and on your work ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Nice to be with you.